Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another session of Mending Minds. My name is John Vredenberg. I am a dietitian and manager in the UF Health Jacksonville Employee Wellness Program. And I want to thank each of you for tuning in and helping to understand something that I think we all know there's a connection to, and that is, does the food we eat impact our mental health? And is there a correlation between the two? Because I think all of us, especially in the past 2 years, have used food or beverage in some form or another to help us deal with some of the emotions that we're feeling. And will changing some of our dietary patterns help improve our overall mental health and well-being? So we're going to take a close look at a lot of the research about food and mental health, but also give you some tips for looking at what's in your grocery cart and some of the dietary trends and patterns that might be consistent with improved mental health and well-being. So I'm not sure how many of you might be eating right now, but when we look at some of the mental health statistics, you can see there is need to look at new approaches. And this is where nutrition can play a very important role. We're all very aware of the statistics with regards to depression and anxiety, and even some of the subclinical symptoms of each of those, where we're not actually dealing with diagnosed depression or diagnosed anxiety, but we have some of the smaller symptoms of it, I think, is affecting a lot of us. And when we look at some of the treatment approaches, whether they're counseling sessions or pharmaceutical agents, there is a lot to be learned when we look at how our food choices could impact our health and well-being. So what we'll do today, as I said, is we'll look at some of the big topics with relationship to diet and mental health, like sugar intake, and we'll look at emotional eating. We'll talk about comfort foods. We'll look at blood sugar management, and then wrap it up by looking at some of the dietary patterns that are being researched to not just help keep our mental health sharp, but also prevent cognitive decline. And then I'm also going to share with you some resources if you would like to talk to a nutrition professional a little bit more closely about your food choices. So if we look at some of the research on diet and mental health, it gets a little complicated, because there's the question that you have to ask yourself, what's actually coming first? Is it the diet or is it depression? Do people with depression seek out food choices that are, consistent with high sugar, high added fat, or are those types of food choices leading individuals to become more depressed? A lot of times we look at food as a way to comfort ourselves, and we have to ask ourselves, is the consistent desire to seek out foods like ice cream leading us to become more depressed? So a lot of the research when we look at diet and mental health is complicated by the concept of what's called reverse causation, which comes first, the chicken or the egg. And that's what we're starting to learn more and more about. It used to be that we thought that, yeah, there is reverse causation, meaning when we are depressed, we are seeking out high sugar, high salt, high fat foods. But now we're learning a little bit more about how specific nutrients and how specific dietary patterns are leading to higher rates of mental disorders. So it's not actually reverse causation. And one of the biggest contributors early on, at least in some of the wider studies that have been done, has to do with sugar. So we all know what sugar can do to us from a cardiac standpoint, from a weight standpoint, but what we're also seeing links now is between higher sugar intakes and higher rates of depression. So overall, if we look at what the guidelines are for men and women, you see them right there on your screen, about 6 to 9 teaspoons each day. That's what the American Heart Association recommends as an upper limit. But on average, Americans consume about 3 times that recommended amount each day. And we've seen research that shows that intake at 2 to 3 times that level is directly causing higher rates of depression. And again, the reason for that depression is still being, further analyzed. But when we look at some of the controlled studies, and we look at, there was one 30-year study that I've got your citation right there on the screen if you want to pull it up later, of 10,000 participants, showed a direct correlation between depression and higher sugar intake, even with controlling for other complicating factors like prior mental health histories. So when we look at sugar intake, there's some hypotheses where we try to make those connections as researchers in food and nutrition. So one of the possible causes could be, unstable blood sugar levels. If we're consistently consuming higher levels of sugar, we can see large fluctuations in blood sugar levels, which could lead to depression. Could be a result of nutrient deficiencies. As we all know, if our diet is comprised of a lot of high sugar foods, we might be displacing more nutrient dense food choices, which in turn can impact our ability to create neurotransmitters. Maybe it's leading to more inflammation. And then the other thing that higher sugar diets seem to do is reduce the amount of brain-derived neurotropic factor, which plays a very important role in our mental health and well-being. So when we look at all of the research and dietary trends of what to really hone in on, sugar seems to be one of the things at the top of the list. Now, some of the other aspects of a brain healthy diet aren't going to surprise you when we talk about higher amounts of fruits and vegetables and healthy fats and minimal amount of added fats, but it's the sugar that we really need to closely scrutinize. So pay close attention to those upper limits, because if you're looking at food labels, you'll notice very quickly it can add up. If you were to have just one can of regular soda, that could be about 40 to 50 grams of sugar right there. So it's something that we can look at pretty closely and take immediate action to try to reduce our amount that we're consuming. And a lot of times we seek out sugar when we're not feeling at our best, when we are feeling emotional. And again, that's where it can be somewhat challenging to try to figure out what the link is and which comes first, the diet or the depression. But as I said before, we are seeing more and more research emerging that shows sugar is something that we need to be very cautious with, especially in terms of preserving mental health and well-being. And just like any other Zoom presentation or chat, if you have questions along the way, type them into the chat and I'll be sure to get to those. If not immediately, then at least at the very end. And we're also recording this session, and details on how to access that recording will be made available because it's specific to which campus you might be in. So let's take a look at the screen now, because this is something I think we can all relate to. So take a look at any of these questions and see if you can answer yes as we start to untangle emotional eating, which is the one thing that I think we can all closely relate to. So if you find yourself answering yes to any one of these questions, you would be considered an emotional eater. Now, it's not a value judgment. It's estimated that in our society with food readily available, about 75% of eating is emotionally driven. But in order to really recognize this behavior, it's important not to cast self-judgment, not criticizing yourself because you had a cookie or a serving of ice cream or a piece of fried chicken, because that type of self-judgment is not doing anything for you. And in fact, it's only going to make the issue even worse. So we start to untangle and learn to manage emotional eating. It's important to first recognize that you are an emotional eater when you're dealing with some of these issues, and that's okay. There are ways to manage it, but we do not want to cast self-judgment upon ourselves, because it's just not productive at all. We'll also see that emotional eating tends to follow a cycle. For those of us that have found ourselves on our couch after a long day of work and we're either holding a bottle of wine or a container of ice cream or both, you can understand how that cycle can emerge. We are experiencing a stressor and we need some comfort, and we look to food to solve that comfort, to give us that feeling of relief. And it does feel good. It feels good for maybe just a short period of time. And once that positive feeling starts to fade, then we start to feel guilty. And then that only magnifies the stress. So as we start to look at this, it's important to understand that emotional eating requires an emotional solution. We're using emotional eating to escape, to numb, to amplify our feelings. And in order to try to solve this puzzle, we're going to require an emotional solution. And again, remember, a lot of us do this. And as I said, 75% of our eating can be emotional, but it's only a problem if food is your only way of coping with the issue. And that's important to understand. So what are those causes? As those of us who've answered yes to any of those questions, we realize that, yeah, stress is a big one, but we also emotionally, when we're bored, or maybe it's just out of habit, how we were raised and how we're rewarding behaviors. If you did well at school and you got some ice cream, or any one of these are some common causes of emotional eating. And again, not meant to be a judgment. It's just how these habits start to emerge. There's a lot of social influence in this as well. So it's important to really try to untangle the causes of emotional eating, because that helps us better manage a solution. If we know we're dealing with stress, if we know we're dealing with anxiety, if we know we're dealing with boredom, we can attack those issues one at a time, and therefore not use food as our only coping mechanism. So raise your hand or sound in the chat if you've ever had a craving for donuts, just by seeing donuts, by walking by them, by smelling them, by seeing the hot donuts now sign. Very common, right? Very common. Raise your hand if you've ever had a craving for broccoli. So if we look at cravings for broccoli, I'm seeing less people vote for that. Some people voted that I thought I craved. I thought you said donuts again. No, we're looking at all the different types of issues here when we look at cravings and emotional hunger. And I'm not trying to say that we're always craving donuts and never crave broccoli, because that's not true at all. We can crave a variety of foods. But what I want you to understand is that emotional hunger, different than physical hunger, because it comes on suddenly. All right. So if you're looking at a food selection and all of a sudden you want it, whether it's donuts, whether it's broccoli, whether it's potato chips, whether it's pizza, whether it's wings, and it comes on all of a sudden, that's emotional hunger. There's a difference between I want something to eat and versus I want some Doritos. So emotional hunger is usually tied to very specific foods. We also know that emotional hunger is not located in the stomach, it's located in the head. And that emotional hunger may also lead to feelings of guilt, feeling that, gosh, why did I eat this or that? Because I did feel good temporarily, but now I only feel worse. Physical hunger. So this is important to understand, because physical hunger comes on gradually. It can really be satisfied with anything. When we look at, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, that's the expression comes from, you can satisfy physical hunger with any type of food choice. It's not tied to something specific. And physical hunger is going to stop when you're full. So when we look at trying to manage emotional eating, we have to first recognize emotional hunger different from physical hunger. And as I said before, the first step to managing it is recognize first that you are doing it, and then look at why you're doing it. Is it because you're depressed or lonely? Then call somebody, or look at some old photos, or look at some old videos, or play with a pet. Are you anxious about something that's going on in your work or your home life? And you maybe use that energy to get out and get some sunlight, or go for a brisk walk, or do some dancing. Are you wiped out? Are you emotionally eating because you just get home and you're exhausted? Well, look at some other non-food solutions for dealing with some of that exhaustion, and have a nice hot cup of tea. Or if you're bored, step away from the kitchen table, walk away from the refrigerator. We tend to eat with our eyes, and what we see, we often want. So if you're eating out of boredom, you need to relocate out of that kitchen. Again, go outside again, listen to some music, read a book, watch a comedy video, whatever it is. Important to recognize first that you are doing emotional eating, and then try to develop a non-food solution around each one of those types of variables that might be causing that emotional eating. Because remember, we emotionally eat for a variety of reasons. We want to try to treat the specific reasons. And if you notice that these emotions are starting to boil over, where you are feeling more anxious and more exhausted and more depressed, then ask for help. We have mental health resources available on both campuses in Jacksonville as well as in Gainesville. So it's important to try to take advantage of those resources and get the help that you need. So if we look closely at food and mood, I wanted to just briefly give you some definitions, not spend a lot of time with these particular words here when we look at neurotransmitters, but we do know that these circulate around our body and really affect how we concentrate. So serotonin, I think we've all heard that term before. That's that feel good neurotransmitter. It gives us that sense of calm, and it relieves some of the cravings. The dopamine rush, that's what happens when we get that attention sharpened and we're more motivated. We also see it with norepinephrine. So these are important because how we build these neurotransmitters is found on our plate. So nutrients serve as the building blocks for these neurotransmitters. And if we're not eating a well-balanced diet, that's going to impact our brain's ability to generate functional neurotransmitters and impact our ability to communicate, impact our ability to concentrate. It can cause fluctuations in our mood, and not just from how our diet's constructed, but also how our meals are spaced throughout the day too. So if you've gone several hours without eating, you know how that can impact your mood. And again, that's directly relates to the function of neurotransmitters. So take a close look at how your food is scheduled. If you find yourself getting hangry, where you're getting a little bit more upset because you haven't eaten in a while, then take a look at trying to get a snack scheduled there, or take a look at your previous meal to see how it's constructed. Most, what we say, well-balanced, you hear that term before, well-balanced meals should keep us feeling full for about 4 to 5 hours. Now, it varies based on what's in the meal, but if you find yourself hungry 2 hours after eating a meal, chances are it didn't have everything that was going to make it a little bit more balanced. So when we look at balancing out that meal, this is where protein, this is where dietary fiber, this is where healthy fat can really lead us to greater mealtime satisfaction and prolong that feeling of fullness. Now, let's talk about something that I think we can also relate to, and that is our comfort foods. So if we are emotional eating, we emotionally seek out foods that make us comfortable. And again, it's not always the high calorie foods that we might seek out for our personal comfort. That's why I asked about broccoli as well as donuts. We're looking for a source of comfort. It's whatever it is that you consume that gives you that feeling of well-being. And most of the research about comfort foods is associating with that food choice with something from our childhood or something from our past or something from our home cooking that takes us back to a time where we felt a little bit better. And most of it's tied to childhood because, let's face it, when we're kids, we didn't have the stresses that we have now. So this is why a lot of those comfort foods can be passed down from generation, whether it's grandma's mac and cheese or apple pie or whatever it might be. That's why there's a strong correlation between comfort foods and our overall childhood or how we were raised or what foods that might make us feel better. They did a survey about 25 years ago that looked at what people often select when they are looking for these comfort foods. You got potato chips was at the top of the list, as well as ice cream and fresh baked cookies, as well as pizza and pasta. And the interesting thing they found in this study is that it was actually gender specific, whereas females were the ones that were seeking out more ice cream and colder type items, and males were seeking out warmer items, so pizza and pasta and burgers. So there was an interesting connection there when we look at the temperature of a food choice and the type of nutrients it provided based on gender. So the men tended to crave more meat-based warm dishes, where women tend to crave more sugar-based colder items. And there's some thoughts here as to why these comfort foods are things that make us feel good. We all know that eating these palatable foods, whether it's a chocolate chip cookie or a slice of pizza, it may release some of these opiates that make us feel better. But really, much of the data, when we look at how comfort foods make us feel, is that they really kind of take us back to these prior positive experiences. Maybe you were someone that after you had, good behavior, you were given ice cream, or you're taken on a field trip where they made some fresh baked cookies, whatever it is. Your family owned a pizza stand, whatever it is. These types of food selections prime thoughts of prior positive experiences. And again, we seek those out for feelings of comfort. And that's not a problem. Remember, emotional eating and seeking out comfort foods is only an issue if it's our only way of coping with that situation, or if that coping mechanism is interfering with our health and well-being. If you are trying to get through a stressor by eating an entire container of ice cream, but you also have type 2 diabetes, then that's not going to be an optimal solution for you. The other role here, when we look at constructing our diet to help manage our mental health, is to look not just at the sugar intake, but also refined carbohydrates. So refined carbohydrates would be things like your white bread, your white rice, your regular pasta, things that are stripped of their natural dietary fiber. So if we have diets that are higher in these types of carb selections, we see an increase in our blood sugar. As that blood sugar increases, insulin is released to help move the sugar into the cells. Once that happens, as a counter regulatory hormone, insulin is going to lower those blood sugar levels. Hunger ultimately returns again, and the mood changes. And then again, we seek out something to correct it immediately, which is another refined carb. So these are those blood sugar fluctuations that may play a role in those higher rates of depression that we talked about earlier. So this is why when we look at some of the common denominators of diets that are going to be associated with improved mental health and well-being, it's those food choices where you have some fiber. You have whole foods like fruits and vegetables, along with limited amounts of the added sugars and added fats. We see changes in the structure of our brain proteins, improved connections between the brain cells. We elevate our serotonin levels. We also promote a healthy gut. Food choices that are naturally high in dietary fiber and healthy fat are also associated with a healthier gut, which can decrease inflammation. And again, we know that inflammation is also known to affect our cognition and our mood. So again, when we look at dietary patterns that are going to be helpful for our brain, you'll also notice they're the same dietary patterns that are helpful to our heart. So a heart healthy diet is also a brain healthy diet. At the end, I'm also going to share with you a grocery list to kind of help you get started in the grocery store when we look at trying to build our plate to help support improved mental health and well-being. So as we wrap up, and again, allow plenty of time for questions here too, it's important to understand that the big picture here. We know that, trying to connect individual foods to higher or lower rates of specific conditions can be pretty frustrating, because it's almost impossible to tease out individual foods and its impact on our health and well-being. We also know that there's many causes of mental illness. There are many and they're varied. And I think the thing I want you to understand is that when we look at food choices, foods by themselves shouldn't be termed healthy and unhealthy. We don't want to get into the habit of categorizing food as good or bad. And we want to try to get out from that umbrella of diet culture, which tends to to vilify certain foods and really look at a food choice in the overall context. And that's what determines whether or not it's healthy. So yes, a donut can be part of a healthy diet. Now, an all donut diet, that cannot be part of a healthy diet, but we always want to take a step back and see the forest for the trees and try to make sure we understand the entire big picture here. Because when we look at some of the diets that trigger diseases like depression and anxiety, they also have a lot of comorbidities such as high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. So it's important to understand that there's a lot going on with food, but we do know enough that building a nutrient dense plate, whether you're following the Mediterranean diet or the DASH diet, which is used to help control blood pressure, that is a good way to get started on trying to change our diet to improve mental health. And probably one of the leading diets out there now, when we look at trying to reduce rates of dementia and brain decline, is a combination of those two aforementioned diets, the Mediterranean and the DASH diet. And that's called the MIND diet. So that's the Mediterranean DASH intervention for neurodegenerative delay. And that's basically combining the key aspects of that Mediterranean diet, which is heavy in fish and liberal consumption of healthy fats and oils, and the DASH diet, which also advocates including plenty of fruits and vegetables each day, as well as trying to minimize added salt. So again, as I said before, what's good for the heart is also good for the brain. And as we send out post-class materials, you can click on the various links in this presentation and not just find the research that was discussed, but also a very good further description that talks about what's on the MIND diet right here at the foodinsight.org website. So if we're looking to talk more about food and nutrition, we do have nutrition counseling available for all Gator Care members. So if you go to that link right there, gatorcare.org/food4thought, you can schedule your appointment right away based on what's available. We use the Pick a Time scheduling service for that. So again, this is just for Gator Care members. If you're not a Gator Care member, you can simply search eatright.org, find a nutrition expert for help in your area so they can help you in person or they can help you virtually. And each of these are going to connect you with a registered dietitian, somebody who is credentialed to discuss food issues with you. So if there are any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat there. I'll be here. I'm going to stick around for a while. You want to take the short quiz here, I'm going to drop it in the chat again. So this is just a simple post test to account for attendance, but also just ask you a few questions on the material that was covered. So you can take it right now by clicking on that link on your screen, or you can take out your smartphone or smart device and scan that QR code and take it as well. Our next and final class will be on May 19th, so 1 week from today, where Nick will be talking about setting some SMART goals for mental health and well-being, and then discussing a little bit more the concept of resiliency. So again, I do thank you for sticking around and hanging out with me. I'll be hanging out and answering questions in the chat, and I'm just going to go ahead and stop the recording now. So thank you.